Good morning, everybody. Today, Andy and I are going to talk about distribution planning for building electrification. And we will start off by discussing the impact, and I'll talk about impact and challenges of building electrification and distribution system planning. And then I'll talk about a few strategies to address that. And then I'll talk about some energy efficiency and demand flexibility programs that can be used to address building electrification. And then I'll hand it over to Andy, and he will talk about the value of efficiency and demand flexibility programs and energy and bill impacts, including, spoiler alert, an analysis of his own bill. Sorry, Andy. So buildings, when buildings are switching from natural gas to electricity for heating, can have a significant impact on the electricity grid. And the majority of natural gas consumption in residential and commercial buildings is for space heating, which is what the blue portion of these charts are. And so it can have a very significant impact depending on where you are located. But it's not going to be the same impact everywhere. However, regardless of where you're located, building electrification can impact your distribution system grid. And so the states that are on the left side of this chart are using more delivered fuels for their energy, and the states that are on the right side of the chart are using more electricity in their energy consumption. But regardless of where you are in this chart, if you have, if you're on the left side and you're moving from delivered fuels for space heating to electricity, you're going to have load growth on your distribution systems. If you're on the right side, you might already have lots of electric space heating, but perhaps those are going to become more efficient. And so regardless of where you're at, as electrification occurs, it's going to impact your distribution system. And it's going to happen differently in utility service territories across different states. It's not just going to be, a uniform assumption. There will be pockets of load growth that occur as electrification is happening. And this graphic that's on the left side of the slide shows different counties in Massachusetts that have electricity or delivered fuels for their gas consumption. And orange counties have higher electricity heat, and blue ones have less for their heating sources. So as you can see, the growth is going to be quite different across the state. And, just stepping back, when we think about load growth, building electrification is not the only thing that's going to cause load growth, right? Like new loads are going to come online, and understanding what your buildings are doing and what is causing load growth in your buildings is going to be different across your service territory, as well as across your utilities in your state. And this is just an example from PacifiCorp's IRP. They're looking at their 6 different states, and there's a variety of different building types that are causing load growth for them. And understanding the intersection of your building electrification with your new load growth is important as you consider your planning. 2 big challenges with building electrification and the distribution system planning is, the first one is climate and weather. So as we experience extreme weather events, particularly in the winter, and we have buildings that are being heated with electricity, there's a higher risk for impact on people living in those buildings if electricity goes out. It's also the way that these the heat pumps and electrified heating operate differently under extreme cold weather, and it causes the equipment to run differently and is more stressed out, and the load profile looks differently. And so understanding that as a distribution system planner and understanding how weather is going to impact how your building is operating as it becomes electrified is important. The other one is that, as I mentioned, there's going to be pockets of load growth, and understanding where those pockets are happening, both from building electrification as well as vehicle electrification, and thinking through what the impact of that is. This is just an example from Maine. They had a pretty big policy push to implement heat pumps, and this shows their growth from, I think it's 2015 to 2024. So there's strategies that we can use to help address load growth from building electrification. And there's 4 of them that I'll talk about. The first one is around load forecasting. The second one is around reconsidering your core planning assumptions. Third is improving reliability and resilience metrics. And fourth is around information sharing. So this first one, load forecasting, there's a couple of different things a couple different points to make on this one. First, planners can expand their forecast horizon. Individual electrification projects, particularly in existing buildings, can happen slowly and over time. It's not necessarily going to be a rapid growth. As we all know, retrofits in buildings don't often happen at a super fast rate. But the long turnover time of those buildings, coupled with perhaps moderate weather, could really dampen the effect of the electrification on the distribution system grid. And then if you have a very cold year where you have reached a higher level of adoption with your electrification, you might see a really surprising outcome with what's happening on your distribution system. And so looking at longer lifetimes for your forecasting is one approach that can be used. And then you can broaden the factors that are being considered in your load forecasting, which similarly to expanding the forecast horizon is looking beyond recent trends when you're developing your forecast. And just because it's the way it's happened thus far doesn't mean that it's necessarily the way that it's going to continue to happen. And so just thinking more robustly about your forecasting in distribution system planning. This figure that's on the slide shows how historical trends and known projects make up the majority of the inputs in short-term forecasts. But physics-based modeling and understanding what your end-use load consumption is in your buildings is what's going to make up a larger percentage of your input factors as your forecasting looks further out into the future. So another thing with load forecasting, planners consider how buildings are being used to establish a better baseline. So this goes back to, what are the end uses in your building and how are they being consumed and when are they being consumed and how is that changing? And understanding what your building types are and how those are growing as well. So a better understanding of what's happening and who's using energy in your buildings. Another one is considering the impacts of weather in more depth. I already touched on this a little bit, but understanding how different weather impacts are going to show up on your distribution system as electrification is occurring. And then finally, forecasters can look into considering multiple forecasts and looking at scenario analysis. And this quote that's at the bottom is from Minnesota. It's talking about how the commission is requiring scenario analysis. And this is a pretty emerging area for distribution system planning to require scenario analysis, but it's certainly something that can be done. So the second strategy that I'll talk about for mitigating or considering the impacts of building electrification in planning is to reconsider your core planning approaches. And 4 of those are shown on the bottom of the slide. First, design conditions, which is how hot or how cold it's going to be outside. You can think about the thresholds, which is, for example, how much loading on your feeder the utility is comfortable with, or how much loading on the feeder is appropriate before you start needing to expand. Understanding for your headroom, what your appropriate planning margin is. And also understanding your load diversity. So again, not everything is going to be turned on at the same time. So going back to knowing what's happening in your buildings, having a better understanding of when that's happening, and not assuming that everybody shows up at home at 5 p.m. and turns everything on at 100%, because that's going to look pretty bad on the distribution system. Planners can also go beyond a single peak hour. And this doesn't have to be 8760 analysis, but it could be considering representative days in a month, just going beyond one single peak hour when they're thinking about what is the impact on the planning. And then I'll talk about my last 2 bullets on my next slides. So planners can consider how to improve reliability and resilience metrics, such as thinking about how we're measuring success, giving changing risk, and also if there's other metrics that may need to be considered around reliability and resilience. So in distribution reliability metrics, major event days are typically excluded, and they're removed from the trends so that when planners are looking at what's going to happen, their forecast moving forward. They can understand the trends year over year and don't react to one really significant event that really spikes. But the counter argument to that, as we have increased building electrification, is that the risk that's associated with these extreme weather events is very significant, particularly in the cold weather, if your buildings are relying on electricity for space heating. And understanding if health and human safety should perhaps be part of this conversation and part of your reliability or resilience metrics. And what these charts on the right side of the slide show are, the top one is the system average interruption duration index minutes, and it's outages with major event days in blue and without them in orange. And then the chart on the bottom is the same thing for frequency index. And so there's quite a bit of difference in minutes per year when you include your major event days as opposed to when you don't. And it's fine if those occur at times where it's not significant on the grid, but if those are happening during the winter, that's going to be a pretty big deal. There is one example that we have from distribution system planning. I'm sure there's others. This is the one that I have. Consolidated Edison, Con Ed in New York has a benefit cost analysis handbook that they file with their distribution system implementation plan. Their most recent version has 2 reliability and resilience benefits that they include in their analysis. The first one is net avoided restoration costs, which accounts for the avoided cost of restoring power outages. And the second one is net avoided outage cost, which accounts for customer outage cost due to a reduction in frequency and duration of outages. And so some of the utilities are starting to look into this and consider how they could quantify or include it. My last point my last strategy to talk about for addressing building electrification and planning is to think about sharing information across natural gas and electric utilities. And we put out a report in January or December from Regulatory Assistance Project and Berkeley Lab, where we identified characteristics of integrated electric distribution planning, and we focused on indicators and benefits of moving towards integrated planning. And this is a very nascent area and everyone's struggling with it. But this chart is an example of what we included in the report. One of the characteristics that we identified of what an integrated electric gas planning process would have is aligned inputs for forecasting and planning. And then we talked about how it could produce many different benefits, which included lower costs, increased reliability, and improving the confidence of regulators and stakeholders in utility investment decisions. And there's, I believe the task force is still going on with NARUC on natural gas, thinking through the integrated planning and a variety of other issues associated with the combination of electric and gas planning. So that's a good resource to look into as well. And then one of the examples I have is from Massachusetts. They're really on the cutting edge of thinking through how to deal with integrating electric and gas planning. And the regulators required the electric distribution utilities to participate in planning with the gas distribution utilities in their overlapping territories. And they have some plans that are due that consider this, I think, next year. And then they have I believe their integrated energy plan was due last month, but I didn't actually get to check to see if anything was filed. But I'm sure our Massachusetts people in here know the answer to that off the top of their head. So the last section of my presentation is on different types of efficiency and demand flexibility programs that can be used to help mitigate or address building electrification growth. And one big one is states can promote efficient electrification. We did an analysis with Fort Collins utilities, and we found that efficient electrification reduced the summer and the winter peak demand on representative feeders. And so what this chart shows is the baseline efficiency electrification, which is the blue line, that's the highest, the orange line, which is the high efficiency electrification. So you can see a reduction both and a shift in timing in both the summer and the winter peaks on this day. And then also what the 2018 net load was, so kind of where we were starting from. And we did this across several different representative feeders, and the findings were generally the same. States can encourage utilities to design energy efficiency programs that reduce peak demand. This is also really great if you're looking for a focus on affordability. If you are reducing peak demand and maybe targeting your programs at customers that are the most vulnerable, you're getting a win-win. It's going to bring down system costs as you reduce peak demand as compared to what they would be otherwise. And you're also going to help out some of your more vulnerable customers. This is some work that we have done for a long time at Berkeley Lab on the cost of saving electricity and the cost of saving peak demand. What this chart shows is savings by different program types. The width is the quantity and the height is the cost. And one of the takeaways here is that the vast majority of the savings that are happening from the efficiency programs that we looked through are coming in at less than $200 a kilowatt. And so, you know, it's not the only answer, but it certainly is part of the solution, thinking through efficiency and thinking about how you can target peak demand reductions with your efficiency programs. And this isn't demand response, this is only energy efficiency. And then this is an example from Minnesota. This is touching on the geo-targeted energy efficiency programs that we talked about yesterday. Lisa talked about it a little bit. We talked about it with non-wires. So Minnesota Excel implemented this pilot program, and they were hoping to defer a $4 million capacity upgrade on a transformer feeder and feeder configuration, and they had about 5 years to do it. And they ran a pilot for, I think, a little bit over a year. And what this shows is what they were able to achieve. So on the right side, it's the energy efficiency measures and load control programs that were used to meet their goal. And the program overperformed. They saved more energy than they needed to, and it predominantly came from commercial lighting as well as demand response. States can also encourage utilities to promote demand flexibility. And this can come in lots of different ways. It can come through creating building codes that have demand response or demand flexibility ready buildings. It can come from encouraging different design structures. There's lots of demand flexibility programs that are out there that have long-standing history of success. And we did a report that looked at, you know, what are the different types of incentives that are being used for demand flexibility programs? What's the price point that most programs are offering? Are they pay for performance? Is it an upfront incentive? And so there's lots of different ways that you can go about achieving your demand flexibility, and there's many different program designs that have been successful. And then states can also encourage utilities to think innovatively about their outreach approach. And we talked about this a little bit with stakeholder engagement. You know, utilities aren't always necessarily the best at reaching their customers in an effective way. But they can think about different ways to communicate with their customers and see what motivates them to participate in a program. You know, it could, for the most part, what motivates customers uniformly across many studies is saving money. However, there's lots of other reasons that people are interested in this, and it includes improving your community or environmental benefits or reliability or resilience. And so understanding what motivates particular segments of customers and encouraging the utilities to think through that and market to them in a specific way is another way that demand flexibility can be really effective. I have two more examples, and then it'll be up, Andy will be up. Targeted electrification is certainly another approach that can be used. This is where you're strategically decommissioning portions of the gas system. And this can happen because, you know, there's only a couple of people at the end of the line and it needs to be repaired, and the cost to repair it is, you know, going to be too much. And so you can decommission that line and move people to electricity, and it can be less expensive. There's lots of states that are promoting targeted electrification. California has a lot of work in this area. They're requiring the CPUC to create pilots that designate up to 30 neighborhood decarbonization zones to think about where they can transition from gas to all electric or thermal energy. And there's several examples of the targeted electrification in California. There's one in Albany, which is outside the Bay Area, and in Monterey. And PG&E has over 100 of these different targeted electrification projects that they've done. Colorado had a program that went through its first winter this year on manufactured home electrification. And in Massachusetts, again, the DPU required the electric and gas utilities to work on pilots around decarbonization and electrification. And then 8 different states are looking at thermal energy networks, which is where you can use your existing gas pipelines to use warm or cold water to heat and cool your buildings. And so this is an area of quite a bit of growth, as well as is looking more into thermal energy networks. And then my last example is front of the meter efficiency. So conservation voltage reduction and volt-var are 2 different approaches that can be used. These bring down the voltage levels to minimum levels and produce significant efficiency savings. These are programs that are pretty common across a lot of utilities. They can produce a lot of savings. In Illinois, their evaluation, measurement, and verification report on their program, their CVR program, they saved 87 gigawatt hours and 13 megawatts of peak demand. So it can be a really significant program if you don't already have it implemented to think about. And with that, I will hand it over to Andy. Oh gosh, you're here. I kept looking back there.
I didn't know where to stand. I was like lurking on the side. Yeah, sorry. Thanks. And here I am. Enter stage left. Good morning, everybody. I'm Andy Satchwell. I'm a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So Natalie did a great job kind of laying out the case for why building electrification matters for planning and some of the strategies to sort of mitigate some of the impacts of that. So I'm going to now start with what's the value of those strategies in a planning context, and then talk about how to reflect that value in the design specifically around like customer incentives and customer rate designs. So let's first talk about the value of efficiency and demand flexibility programs for future grids, especially future grids that reflect this high building electrification future. So, as Natalie was saying, if you think about inefficient electrification, so a world of a lot of electric resistant space and water heating can really add significant load, right? And that load is going to drive much higher costs. This figure comes from a study that we published that looked at what were the costs to the bulk power system. So this is just generation and transmission costs, but I think the same, upward trend would be true for distribution costs to meet this demand growth from inefficient electrification. So obviously new capital investments in generation and transmission, as well as in the context of grids that are transitioning to higher capital cost, but lower marginal cost, clean energy and renewable resources as well. Grid systems under inefficient electrification, a lot of space and water heating, are going to have switch from summer to winter peaking as well. And so those new peak requirements are going to drive these costs. And really quite dramatic, our most kind of extreme case on the far right here was a very aggressive decarbonized power sector, but you can really see more than or almost triple the costs of the power sector from 2030 to 2050. So this is the opportunity, right, to bring down those costs. And how can we do that? Natalie was also talking about these locational impacts, right? When you think about these impacts, not only the bulk power system and regional grids, but very specifically for states and counties and within distribution networks, it's going to look very different when you look across states. So this is some analysis that we've been doing to look at county level load impacts of electrification. This happens to be from heat pumps, right? And you can see this is just heating demand. And you can see even within states that some counties are going to experience decreases in their heating demand because they're in many respects replacing less efficient electric heating with more efficient heat pumps. And in some cases, they're replacing fossil-based heating, like a gas heating system, with a heat pump, which is whole new electricity load. Or an increase in electricity load. And so really thinking about these impacts, even at a county level, is really important. So efficiency and flexibility can mitigate these load increases that we talked about. So I think this comes from that same study that I started with, showing you the costs to the bulk power system. Maybe Texas and the Northwest are the best examples of a couple of dynamics that are happening. So in a future Texas system of high electrification, you have an increase in the summer peak as you add new electricity loads, especially from like this study included, converting your cooktops to like electric cooktops from gas ranges, and replacing water heaters, gas water heaters with electric ones. So you increase the system peak in the summer, and you also shift it to later in the day, especially as those cooking loads now are electrified. But energy efficiency and demand flexibility put downward pressure on those peak demand increases. And you can see that on the far right here as that peak goes up when inefficient electrification, efficiency, demand flexibility, and heat pumps, which are a more efficient form of cooling, really bring that peak down. Similarly, to some extent, but with a few other important dynamics, on the Northwest, you have a system that is a winter peaking system, right? The building electrification puts upward pressure on those winter peaks as you electrify heating. But if you do it with heat pumps, which are incredibly efficient, and you implement energy efficiency and demand flexibility, you likewise put downward pressure on those peaks. So what's this all worth, right? What's the value of all of this? So we found using those assumptions and just kind of representative, it gives you a sense that it's a lot, right? It can be up to a third of those costs that we talked about, those incremental costs, if you target energy efficiency, demand flexibility, and you pursue heat pumps instead of inefficient electric resistance sources. The value is particularly high in power systems that have much more aggressive load growth, as well as those related to systems with renewable and clean energy goals, because you're putting downward pressure on those new capital investments. And I think you can really see it here. We broke these down by just on a grid region basis. The regions that had the highest value, so the highest avoided cost from efficiency and demand flexibility and heat pumps, were those that were switching to winter peaking from electrification. This is the New York City system that's incredibly transmission constrained. This is basically like Manhattan, right? So to whatever you can do to avoid needing to bring energy in and out and rely on these very constrained ties has a ton of value. So it shows you the types of characteristics of systems where this value is particularly pronounced. Okay, so what does this mean for customers? What does this mean for rates and incentives? So let's talk a little bit about the energy and bill impacts and some of the efficacy of alternative rate designs and incentives. So from the customer perspective, right, building electrification can either result in bill increases or decreases. So on the far left, we modeled building electrification and some different utility systems that represent different regions. On the whole, across these full distributions of customers, so these are box and whisker plots, which basically shows we simulated 10,000 customers in every one of these locations. So that's from the very top line to the very bottom line, that's all 10,000 customers, right? On the far left, you see a reduction in energy consumption across the board for every single customer. And this is because heat pumps and building electrification are incredibly energy efficient relative to their non-electric counterparts, right? Like your, gas furnace, right, has like a 90, best like a 90, 95% efficiency. A heat pump has 300% efficiency, right, on an energy basis. It's converting 1 unit of energy into 3 units of output there. But, and this is importantly, however, some customers' bills may increase or decrease, largely driven by the differential in what customers pay for gas versus what they pay for electricity. So even if their total energy consumption is going down, their bills may go up because that unit of electricity costs more than that same energy unit of a non-electric source. So this is the challenge for building electrification. We further broke this analysis down to say, well, what really sits behind this? What can we start to say about what might drive these bill increases or decreases? So we broke out these customers, all these 10,000 customers, by what was the technology they were starting with in their home. So were they starting with a non-electric technology and replacing it with a heat pump, or an electric technology and replacing it with a heat pump, for example? And what we found was that climate, was it a hot climate or a cold climate, but these baseline building technology characteristics are really critical factors. So customers that started with some sort of an electric baseline technology, like baseboard heating or electric resistance water heaters, by and large, they saw a lot of bill savings because heat pumps are incredibly efficient. It's pure energy efficiency. They were already paying for electricity for that, so it brings down the bill for them. It's these customers with a non-electric baseline, and then also customers who don't have cooling prior to a heat pump, I'll talk about that in a second, But customers that start with a non-electric baseline technology, those are the ones to really focus on and to target programs to bring some bill relief, because they're going to experience a lot of pressure on their bills, again, from that price differential. I mentioned the cooling thing, right? So in some places, so I'm in coastal California, beautiful place, but what's nice about it is Mediterranean climate. A lot of people don't have air conditioning. When you install a heat pump, you get air conditioning, which is great on some hot days. But this is an entirely new load that you didn't have before, and that can drive your bill increases as well. So we found a lot in this analysis of simulated buildings that had no cooling prior to installing the heat pump, saw some pretty large bill increases, which is this bottom part of the figure. So what can we do in terms of rate design and incentives to help mitigate those bill impacts and drive more efficient building electrification and energy efficiency and demand flexibility, because they have value to the system? So a lot of rate proposals out there for driving building electrification focus on shifting how much customers pay as a fixed charge versus a volumetric charge. So if customers pay more of their bill as fixed and less as volumetric, any increase in their volumetric consumption will not drive their bill as much. However, lowering that volumetric rate may lower the incentive to invest in energy efficiency and demand flexibility, because that's where you get a lot of value, right? Like if I'm going to put insulation in my home, if I'm going to replace my lighting, do other energy efficiency measures, I would expect my bill to go down because I consume less electricity. So there's some tension there and some important things to consider. This is an example from Pacific Gas and Electric, a utility that serves a lot of California, particularly the San Francisco Bay Area and Central Valley. This is a rate plan that they have called their sort of e-elec or all-electric home rate plan, and it's designed to encourage home electrification. You qualify for this rate if you have any technology of a heat pump or an electric vehicle. You don't need to be fully electrified, just have one of those technologies or multiple ones. And you can see that it's kind of built around kind of what you think of as a time of use, time differentiated rate with a fairly modest peak to off-peak differential, but it includes this $15 a month monthly service charge, which may not sound like a lot, but as a PG&E customer who right now, I think I pay probably less than a couple dollars a month as a fixed charge on my bill, this is a pretty significant increase in the fixed component of customer bills. So you can see that they're shifting revenue collection to the fixed charge and as a way to lower the volumetric rate. There's also ways to design rates to mitigate these peak impacts, especially from heating demand. Right, so as you electrify, especially non-electric sources like a gas furnace, a lot of heating demand increase on the electricity side. It can drive winter peaks. There's a couple of designs out there. One that's pretty interesting is around dual fuel heat pump system. So a dual fuel heat pump system basically has a fossil fuel backup source. These are particularly prevalent in very cold climates. In some cases, those heat pumps aren't designed or haven't been sized correctly to really meet all the heating demand. So this kind of fossil fuel system kicks in and gives a little bit extra oomph in extremely cold weather. But utilities are increasingly using these dual fuel heat pump technologies to manage electricity demand, especially during winter peak. So think about it. You could actually use that fossil component in the heat pump system to bring down the electricity consumption and reduce the impacts on winter peaks. A couple of co-ops here, one Vernon Electric in Wisconsin, they actually separately have a program where they separately meter residential customer heating demand. If you allow that heating demand to be interrupted during peak events in the winter, they give you a rate discount, 2 cents in the summer and 4 cents a kilowatt hour in the winter. Otter Tail in the northern Midwest part of the country as well provides rate discounts to allow for interruptible heating loads. There is a penalty if you override and don't allow the utility to interrupt your load. So it's kind of a classic demand response program. But in these cases, the heating is separately metered for the customer. So do these rates work as intended? So here's as Natalie foreshadowed, here's my electricity bill for Pacific Gas and Electric. Okay, so I have an old home. It's like over 100 years old. We installed a heat pump system to heat and cool our home. And I'd say we have like moderate building efficiency. Fair enough, we could do a lot better. But we are currently under a tiered rate plan. So this charges a higher rate as our blocks of energy consumption go up. But I'm also have the option of a time of use plan and then that e-elect plan, that all home electricity plan. Well, do as I say, not as I do. I made the wrong choice. I'm paying the most out of all of these plans. And these numbers I just checked this morning. This is from several months ago. This is still the case. I checked this morning, even with the update over a couple more months of heating. But what's interesting is that, remember, this is a high fixed charge rate on the far right, and this is just a time of use rate in the middle. And in this case, a time varying rate may actually achieve that same intent to reduce the bill increases from heating electrification, so without fully muting the incentives to invest in energy efficiency. So time of use rates can still be an important strategy. And then on the left, we had modeled some higher fixed charges to really further drive this point home in the study that I had referenced earlier, showing that, as you increase fixed charges, you reduce the bill impacts for customers with building electrification, you mute that incentive for energy efficiency. In this analysis, if you look along the horizontal axis on that figure on the left, we, in some cases, like doubled and tripled and quadrupled the fixed charge. The political will it would take to go from like even just a $10 a month fixed charge to a $20 a month fixed charge is incredibly high. So we went beyond that, and we saw some benefit to it. But you got to weigh it, right, with the political realities of increasing that fixed charge. Okay, so my final slide here, and then we'll get into some discussion. So what do you do, right? How do you think about designing these programs for customers? Really electrifying buildings and locations that just have low electricity rates, it makes sense, right? There's not as much pressure on customer bills and potential bill increases. Targeting marketing to customers that have those electric resistance technologies as a baseline are going to be likely to experience bill savings, have favorable payback times, and so having targeted marketing to those customers is pretty straightforward. Again, it's those customers with a fossil fuel baseline technology, so natural gas heating, or those without pre-existing cooling that you really need to invest in education with. You really need to walk them along and prepare them for that pressure on their bill that they may see. There are opportunities for additional non-rate financial incentives. There's a lot of value, as we talked about, to efficient building electrification, energy efficiency, demand flexibility. Are there ways to come up with non-rate incentives to drive and incentivize heat pump adoption? And then again, this is a balancing act, right? And this is a tension between lowering that volumetric energy rate by increasing the fixed charge or other rate-making decisions with that incentive to invest in energy efficiency and thinking about not swinging the pendulum too far in either direction. So like all the other presentations so far, we listed some actions that states can take around the topics that we talked about. This includes going back to the thing Natalie talked about, creating working groups to talk about improving load forecasting around building sector load growth. Thinking about location-based load growth is so critical. Thinking about it from an end-use basis is really important. Scenario analysis and load forecast to think about uncertainties that are present in building electrification. Also, just what are the reliability and resilience impacts, the value of more efficient electrification, as we showed. Thinking also about these rate designs. How can you, alter them to mitigate those potential, bill impacts for certain groups of customers, and some other actions there. And then some questions states can ask that relate to that. But I think we should just jump into discussion at this point. Thanks.